The Billionaire's Secret Heir, A Second Chance at Love. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The air was crisp with the scent of roasted chicken and warm spices, wrapping our home in a cocoon of comfort. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling the last stubborn leaves of autumn. The fireplace crackled softly in the corner, a rhythmic heartbeat to our evening, a perfect contrast to the cool October night. Candles flickered on the dining table, their golden light casting delicate shadows against the walls, creating the illusion of movement in the stillness. It was a simple evening, an intimate gathering of three old friends, nothing out of the ordinary. But in hindsight, it was the beginning of something I could never have predicted. I had been married to Daniel for almost 20 years. Our love had settled into a comfortable rhythm, like a song played so many times that the melody became second nature. We had weathered life together, career changes, mortgages, heartbreaks, and the quiet victories that came with time. We understood each other without speaking, finishing each other's sentences, sharing glances that carried the weight of history. It wasn't a fairy tale romance, but it was ours. Steady. Familiar. And then there was Alex. Alex had been Daniel's best friend since college. He was the kind of friend who blurred the line between family and something more nebulous, someone who had woven himself so deeply into our lives that I couldn't remember a time without him. He had been there for our wedding, had toasted to our future with a boyish grin and a promise to always look out for us. He had helped paint the walls of our first home, brought over bottles of wine after stressful weeks, and made himself at home on our couch like it was his own. He had always been charming, effortlessly so. But that night, something felt different. The moment Alex stepped through the door, I felt it, a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible tension that sent a ripple through the evening before it had even begun. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. A flicker of something in his expression? An energy that made my skin prickle? I smiled, brushing the thought aside. "Hey, you made it," I said, stepping forward to embrace him. His arms wrapped around me, firm but fleeting. "Of course. Wouldn't miss it." His voice was warm, but there was something else beneath it, something guarded. Daniel clapped him on the back, his grin easy. "Hope you're hungry. I made your favorite." Alex chuckled. "I'd be an idiot to pass up one of your home-cooked meals." The three of us gathered around the dining table, the conversation flowing as effortlessly as it always had. We talked about work, about the latest headlines, about old memories that made us laugh in that nostalgic way that only old friends can. And yet, even as I laughed, even as I sipped my wine and let the warmth spread through me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Alex was quieter than usual, his eyes lingering too long, as if he was memorizing the way the candlelight danced against my skin. I caught his gaze once, a second too long, and he looked away. A strange flutter stirred in my chest, something I wasn't ready to name. Daniel poured more wine into Alex's glass. "You've been distant lately," he said, his tone light but laced with curiosity. "Everything okay?" Alex hesitated, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. "Yeah. Just a lot on my mind." Daniel nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. That was Daniel, steady, trusting, never one to push where he wasn't invited. But I wasn't so sure. As the night stretched on, the conversation turned more personal, more vulnerable. "I ever tell you guys about the time I almost proposed?" Alex mused, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. Daniel smirked. "You? Mr. Bachelor for life?" I laughed, but something inside me stilled. Alex exhaled a small chuckle, shaking his head. "It was years ago. Before I left for New York." A shadow passed through his expression, gone as quickly as it came. "Why didn't you?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. His eyes flicked to mine, and for the briefest moment, the room fell away. A slow smile curved his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes, you realize too late what you should have done." My breath caught. The way he said it, the weight behind his words, it wasn't just a passing confession. It was something more. Something meant for me. I swallowed hard, looking away as Daniel chuckled, oblivious. "Well, guess it worked out, huh? Would have been weird seeing you settle down," he said, nudging Alex playfully. Alex forced a smile. Yeah. Weird. The air in the room had changed. Not enough for Daniel to notice, but enough that I felt it in every nerve of my body. The walls seemed to press closer, the candlelight suddenly too dim, the wine too sweet on my tongue. I excused myself to clear the plates, needing a moment, needing space. In the kitchen, I set the dishes down with a quiet clatter, bracing my hands on the counter. My heart was racing, and I didn't know why. Footsteps. I turned. Alex stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the warm glow from the dining room. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt charged, like a held breath waiting to be exhaled. His voice was barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have come tonight. I frowned. What? He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. I thought I could do this. Be here, be normal. His jaw clenched. But I can't. Something inside me fractured. I should have asked him what he meant. Should have laughed it off, steered the conversation back to safer waters. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I already knew. And the worst part? A part of me had been waiting for this moment. The weight of unspoken things pressed between us. I could hear Daniel's laughter from the other room, oblivious, trusting. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This simple evening, this ordinary, predictable night, was about to change everything. The evening unfolded with laughter and easy conversation, but there was something beneath it, something I couldn't name. I moved through the kitchen in a familiar rhythm, slicing, stirring, plating, performing each task with practiced ease. And yet, beneath the hum of normalcy, I felt it. A gaze. Alex's eyes were on me. Not just a glance. Not the casual way a friend might look over in passing. It was something more, lingering, deliberate, searching. Each time I glanced up, he was already looking, his expression unreadable, as if he were tracing invisible lines across my face, mapping something he wasn't meant to explore. I forced myself to focus, to shake the feeling. But the awareness of him was there, pressing against me like the weight of a secret. Daniel, oblivious, laughed beside him. They had always been like this, locked in their own world, their conversations flowing with an ease that came from years of friendship. They spoke in half-finished sentences, shared stories with the confidence that the other would remember the details. When they laughed, it was the kind that echoed with history, the kind I had heard 1,000 times before. I had never minded before. Never noticed, really. I had played the part of the accommodating wife, content to stand just outside the edges of their bond. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, I wasn't just an observer. I was outside looking in, watching something unravel beneath the surface. I reached for the wine bottle, pouring another glass for Daniel, another for Alex, my hand steady despite the unease in my chest. You've been quiet tonight, Daniel mused, nudging Alex playfully. That's a first. Alex exhaled a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Just tired, I guess. Tired. That wasn't the word I would have used. He looked at me then, and something flickered in his expression. Something unspoken. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Long week? I asked, my voice even. He hesitated, as if considering his words. You could say that. Daniel, ever trusting, let it go, diving into another story about their college years. I busied myself, collecting the empty plates, moving between them with effortless ease. But even as I walked away, I could feel it, the heat of Alex's gaze trailing after me, settling on the space I left behind. Later, after the meal had been cleared and the wine had settled into our veins, the three of us drifted to the living room. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the silence between conversations. Daniel leaned back into the couch, relaxed and content, his fingers idly spinning his wedding band the way he always did when he was at ease. Alex sat across from me, his posture less easy, his gaze sharper now. Daniel reached for his phone. Give me a second. Work's been breathing down my neck all day. He stood, disappearing down the hall, leaving Alex and me alone. The silence that followed felt different than the easy quiet we had once known. It was weighted, charged. Alex shifted slightly, his knee brushing against mine. A simple accident. A moment of closeness. I should have pulled away. Instead, I stayed. My breath was steady, but inside, I felt something stir. I meant what I said earlier, Alex murmured, his voice low. I blinked. About what? His jaw tightened. About realizing things too late. My fingers curled against the couch fabric, my pulse skipping. Alex. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I know. I shouldn't be saying this. I shouldn't even be thinking it. Thinking what? I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Because I already knew. A warmth crept up my spine, an ache I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. I had always known Alex was attractive. Of course, I had. But it had never been like this, never been something I felt. But now? Now, it was impossible to ignore. Do you ever think about it? He asked suddenly. I swallowed. Think about what? His eyes didn't waver. What it would have been like. If things were different. The air felt too thick, my skin too warm. I started, but the words tangled in my throat. He leaned forward, just slightly. Just enough for me to catch the scent of him, something deep and familiar. It would have changed everything, he said, his voice softer now. I should have stopped this. Should have laughed it off, thrown up a wall, said something about how ridiculous it was. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew there was truth in his words. A different time, a different moment, what would we have been? I parted my lips to say something, anything, but just then, Daniel's voice echoed down the hall. Sorry about that, he called, footsteps approaching. Alex sat back, retreating into himself just before Daniel re-entered the room. And just like that, the moment was gone. But the feeling? The feeling stayed. That night, after Alex left, after the door clicked shut and his presence faded into the night, I climbed into bed beside Daniel, my body curling into the familiar warmth of him. He exhaled contentedly, shifting toward me. Good night? I hesitated. It should have been a simple question. A simple answer. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the weight of Alex's words pressed against my chest. I turned, watching the rise and fall of Daniel's breathing, the peaceful expression on his face. And for the first time in our 20 years together, I wondered if I had missed something. If I had overlooked something that had been there all along. And worse? I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The evening had started like any other, dinner, laughter, the comfortable rhythm of old friends. But now, something felt different. A subtle yet undeniable shift in the air, as though the axis of my world had quietly realigned while I wasn't looking. After dinner, we drifted into the living room, the warmth of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the walls. The scent of burning wood mixed with the remnants of wine and candle wax, creating an intoxicating stillness. Daniel was in high spirits, his laughter easy from the alcohol. He leaned back into the couch, stretching with the familiarity of a man completely at ease in his home. Then, with a groan, he reached for his phone, his expression shifting as he read the screen. Work, he sighed. They never let me breathe. He pressed a kiss to my forehead before standing. I'll just be a minute. His words were directed at both of us, but his focus was already elsewhere. And just like that, he was gone, disappearing down the hall, leaving Alex and me alone. The shift was immediate. Alex's posture changed, just a fraction, just enough. He no longer sat back in casual ease but leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. His eyes, dark and unreadable, settled on me in a way that made my pulse stutter. He exhaled slowly. You seem different tonight. The words sent a shiver through me, though I forced a light chuckle. What do you mean? Alex studied me for a long moment, as if he were debating how much truth to reveal. I don't know. You just feel more alive. More alive. The phrase clung to me, wrapping itself around my ribs, making it suddenly harder to breathe. I shifted, pretending to focus on the flames. That's an odd thing to say. Is it? I glanced at him then, and the intensity in his eyes nearly stole my breath. There was something there, something I had never dared to name. It wasn't just that he was looking at me. It was that he was seeing me. The air between us thickened, stretched taut with something unsaid. The kind of silence that trembles at the edges, waiting to break. I should have said something lighthearted, something to dissolve the moment before it turned into something neither of us could control. But I didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Alex's gaze flickered downward, lingering on my hands where they rested in my lap. His fingers twitched slightly, as if resisting the urge to reach across the space between us. And for one breathless second, I wondered, what if he didn't resist? Before I could dwell on it, Daniel's voice echoed down the hallway. Alex pulled back, his expression shifting in an instant, slipping behind the carefully constructed mask I had always known. I did the same. By the time Daniel returned, the room was exactly as he had left it, warm, inviting, familiar. And yet, something was irreversibly altered. The drive home. Alex left soon after, and though the night continued in its usual rhythm, Daniel pouring us another glass of wine, the two of us retreating to bed, something gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I lay awake long after Daniel drifted into sleep, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the moment in the living room over and over. The way Alex had looked at me. The way I had felt under his gaze. The way something inside me had stirred, something I hadn't even realized had been dormant. Was it just the wine? Just the quiet of the evening, making me overthink? Or was it something more? The next morning, I told myself I would forget it. But forgetting was easier said than done. Unspoken echoes. The following week, life carried on as normal, or at least, it should have. Daniel woke early, kissed my cheek absent-mindedly before heading to work, his mind already miles away in a meeting that hadn't even started yet. I went through my own motions, morning coffee, errands, dinner preparations, but all of it felt slightly off-kilter, as if my world had tilted just a fraction to the left and I hadn't yet found my balance. I didn't see Alex for days. And yet, his presence lingered. I found myself thinking about him at odd moments, when I was folding laundry, when I was grocery shopping, when I was lying beside my husband at night, staring at the ceiling. The memory of his voice, the way he had leaned forward just slightly, the weight of his unspoken words. It all clung to me like a second skin. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. A chance encounter. It was a week later when I ran into Alex unexpectedly. I was leaving the cafe, balancing a coffee cup in one hand, my phone in the other, when I nearly collided with him. He caught my elbow instinctively, steadying me before I could even react. For a moment, we simply stood there, the air between us buzzing with something unspoken. His grip on my arm was warm, grounding. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I echoed, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. He let go, but the ghost of his touch lingered. I swallowed, shifting my bag on my shoulder. "What are you doing here?" "Needed some fresh air," he said. I nodded, trying to ignore the way my pulse was betraying me. "Me too." For a second, neither of us moved. And then, before I could stop myself, I asked, "Do you want to walk?" He hesitated. Just for a moment. Then, he nodded. "Yeah. I'd like that. The walk." We walked in silence at first, the cool morning air wrapping around us. The city was just waking up, the streets still quiet, the world moving in slow motion. It felt strangely intimate, this stolen moment away from the lives we both knew. After a while, Alex exhaled a soft chuckle. "You've been avoiding me." I stiffened. "I haven't." His smirk was knowing. "You have." I bit my lip, hesitating. I just didn't know what to say. Alex glanced at me, his expression softer now. Neither did I. A beat of silence. Then, he murmured, almost too quiet to hear. "But I haven't stopped thinking about it." The word stopped me in my tracks. I turned to face him, my breath caught in my throat. His gaze was steady, but there was something else in it now. Something deeper. Something that sent a shiver down my spine. I should have said something. Should have laughed it off, or changed the subject, or done anything other than what I did do. Which was stand there, heart pounding, wondering if we had just crossed a line neither of us could ever uncross. The realization. When I got home that afternoon, my hands were still shaking. Daniel greeted me as if nothing had changed. As if the world hadn't just tilted beneath my feet. But I knew the truth. There had been a shift. A slow, quiet, irreversible shift. And whether I wanted to or not, I could feel myself slipping towards something I might never be able to come back from. That night, I lay in bed beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft, even rhythm of his breathing. The weight of Alex's words, his lingering gaze, pressed against me like an invisible force, suffocating yet electrifying all at once. I told myself I was imagining things. That I had misread the moment, the unspoken pull between us. That it was nothing more than nostalgia wrapped in wine and candlelight. But deep down, I knew better. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but my mind replayed every stolen glance, every breath of space between us that suddenly felt like an invitation. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. A dance we pretended not to see. The days stretched into weeks, and though I tried, truly tried, to pretend nothing had changed, I couldn't ignore the way the air felt heavier whenever Alex was near. It was in the smallest moments. The way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room and linger for just a beat too long. The hesitation in his voice when he said my name, as though it carried more weight than before. The way my pulse betrayed me at the mere thought of seeing him. We never acknowledged it. Never spoke a word about it. And yet, it existed between us, growing stronger with each passing day. A quiet storm waiting to break. A simple invitation, a loaded decision. One evening, Daniel mentioned a small gathering at Alex's place. Just a few people, he said, barely looking up from his laptop. You up for it? I hesitated. It was nothing unusual. We had been to Alex's home countless times before. It should have felt normal. But the idea of being in his space, of feeling his presence in a setting that blurred the lines of friendship and something more. It sent a shiver through me. Still, I nodded. Of course. Daniel smiled, distracted. Great. It'll be good to catch up. He had no idea. The night that changed everything. Alex's apartment was warm and inviting, filled with the low hum of conversation and soft jazz playing in the background. I made my way to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of wine. I could feel him before I saw him. When I turned, he was there. Standing just close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Hey, he said softly. Hey, I echoed, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. The room faded. The noise, the people, the music, all of it dissolved until it was just us. His eyes flickered down to my lips for the briefest second, and something inside me clenched. I should have stepped away. I should have said something casual, something light. Instead, I just stood there, my grip tightening around my glass. This is dangerous, I whispered before I could stop myself. Alex's jaw tightened. I know. Silence stretched between us. Then, Daniel's voice cut through the air, calling my name, snapping me back to reality. I turned away, forcing a smile as I walked toward my husband. But I felt Alex's eyes on me the entire night. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The evening had settled into its usual rhythm, dishes clinking, the scent of lingering spices in the air, and the low hum of conversation from the living room where Daniel and Alex sat, their voices threading through the walls like ghosts of a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I stood at the sink, rinsing the last of the plates, my mind adrift, when a shift in tone caught my attention. I admire what you and Julia have, Alex said, his voice lower than usual. It's rare to find something that lasts. I stilled. There was a pause before Daniel responded. Yeah, it's been a ride. But we're solid. A small smile tugged at my lips. But then Alex spoke again. Softer this time. Almost hesitant. Do you ever wonder if there's more? The plate in my hands nearly slipped. I gripped it tighter, my heart slamming against my ribs. What was he implying? And why did it feel like those words weren't for Daniel at all? The space between words. I forced myself to keep moving, drawing the plate, placing it carefully in the cabinet, but my ears strained for Daniel's response. He chuckled, a light sound, dismissive. More? Like what? Silence stretched before Alex exhaled. I don't know. Just more. A long pause. Then Daniel laughed again, this time a little louder. Man, you've been drinking too much. I waited for Alex to laugh too. He didn't. Instead, he muttered something I couldn't quite make out before their conversation shifted to something trivial, sports, weekend plans, the latest office gossip. But I wasn't listening anymore. Because my mind was stuck on that single word. More. I turned off the faucet, hands gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady my breath. Had I imagined it? Was I twisting his words into something they weren't? Or had I heard the same quiet longing in his voice that I felt humming under my own skin? The confession that wasn't meant to be. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I lingered in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine, staring at the city lights flickering through the window. I didn't hear Alex come in until he cleared his throat. I turned, startled, my pulse quickening. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets. "Hey," I murmured back, suddenly hyper-aware of the way the air shifted between us. He hesitated, then stepped closer. "I didn't mean for you to hear that." I swallowed hard. But I did. His gaze locked onto mine. "Then you know." My throat went dry. Know what? That he felt it too? That we had been walking a dangerous edge neither of us had acknowledged until now? I wanted to say something. To deny, to deflect, to do anything that might put this moment back into a safe place. But all I could do was stand there, heart pounding, waiting. Waiting for him to say something that would change everything. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I should go." And then he did. Leaving me alone with the weight of all the things we hadn't said. The rain had started sometime that morning, a steady, rhythmic drizzle against the windows, blurring the world outside. It was the kind of day that begged for quiet, muffled conversations, the scent of fresh coffee, the warmth of an oversized sweater. A day that should have been just like any other. But it wasn't. Daniel had been called into work, something urgent that couldn't wait, and I had the house to myself, at least for a while. I told myself I'd spend the day reading, maybe sorting through the closet like I'd been meaning to for weeks. Then Alex showed up. The unspoken invitation. I heard the knock, light but insistent. For a fleeting moment, I considered not answering. But I did. When I opened the door, he stood there, hands in his pockets, his dark sweater damp from the rain. He looked hesitant, but only for a second. Then he smiled, easy and familiar. "Thought I'd stop by," he said. "As you often do," I murmured, stepping aside to let him in. It was true. Alex had always been a presence in our lives, showing up for dinner, bringing over a bottle of wine, watching football with Daniel, talking late into the night about nothing and everything. But today felt different. There was a charge in the air, something unspoken but unmistakable. We settled in the living room, the rain a quiet backdrop as we talked about nothing in particular, work, the weather, a book he'd been reading. But it was there. Beneath the words. The shift. A dangerous truth. At some point, the conversation slowed. The pauses grew longer, stretching into something more dangerous. Alex leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I keep thinking about that night," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. My fingers curled around the mug in my hands, the heat pressing into my skin. "What night?" His lips twitched. "You know which one." I swallowed. "I don't know what you mean." He studied me for a moment, his gaze searching, challenging. Then, slowly, he shook his head, a knowing smile creeping onto his lips. "You do," he murmured. I forced myself to look away, staring at the fireplace, at the flickering flames that did nothing to warm the sudden chill in my skin. We were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. The right thing to do, the only thing to do, was to end this conversation now. To stand up, to put space between us, to remind him, remind myself, that whatever this was, it couldn't happen. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. A line drawn in smoke. The silence stretched, thick with all the things we weren't saying. Then Alex reached for my hand. A simple touch. But it felt like everything. His fingers brushed against mine, tentative at first, as if waiting for me to pull away. I should have. God, I should have. But I didn't. Because the moment his skin met mine, a current ran through me, something dangerously intoxicating. And when I finally looked up, meeting his gaze, I saw the same thing reflected back at me. A question. A choice. The last chance to stop this before we crossed a line we could never uncross. My breath hitched. I opened my mouth, searching for words, for reason, for anything that could break the spell. But then he spoke. "Tell me you don't feel it too." And I couldn't. Because I did. The room felt too small, the air thick with unspoken words and the weight of something neither of us was ready to admit aloud. Alex's hand had barely grazed mine, but the warmth of it still lingered, like an echo in my skin, a sensation impossible to erase. I pulled back, curling my fingers into my palm as if that would somehow erase the moment, undo the choice I hadn't even fully made yet. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice barely more than breath. Alex exhaled sharply, his hand running over his face. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark with something that felt dangerous, not in a physical sense, but in a way that unsettled everything I thought I knew about myself. "I know," he admitted, his voice rough, almost pained. "But tell me you don't feel it." I didn't answer. Because lying to him, to myself, was impossible. A battle between desire and conscience. 1,000 thoughts clashed in my mind, each one fighting to take control. This was Alex. Daniel's best friend. A constant in our lives, a piece of our history. I had known him for years, trusted him, laughed with him, considered him family. And yet, in this moment, he wasn't just Alex, the friend. He was something else entirely. A force pulling me toward the edge of something irreversible. "I should go," he said finally, but he didn't move. I nodded, but I didn't move either. The rain had picked up outside, steady and insistent against the windows. It filled the silence between us, an almost cruel reminder of time pressing forward, of the choices waiting to be made. I turned away first, wrapping my arms around myself as if that could shield me from the chaos inside my chest. "This can't happen," I murmured, trying to force the words to feel absolute, undeniable. "I know," he said again. But it wasn't agreement. It was resignation. I glanced back at him, and that was my mistake. Because the moment our eyes met, I knew I was losing this battle. The moment that defined everything. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough for me to feel the heat of him, to know that if I swayed even an inch, our bodies would collide. I should have stepped back. But I didn't. His gaze searched mine, as if he was looking for the answer, as if he needed me to make this decision for both of us. My pulse pounded in my ears. I thought of Daniel. Of our life, our history, the home we had built. Of every moment that had led to this one. And then Alex spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Tell me to leave." It would have been so easy. 3 simple words. But I couldn't say them. Because some part of me, some deep, hidden part, didn't want him to go. His fingers brushed my wrist, the lightest of touches, yet it felt as if he had branded me, as if his touch had seared into my skin, into my soul. I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply, trying to gather the strength to do the right thing. And then, a sharp knock at the door. An interruption that saved or doomed us. The sound jolted me, snapping me back to reality like a splash of cold water. I stepped away, my breath unsteady, my mind scrambling to catch up. Alex stiffened, his expression unreadable. The knock came again, more insistent this time. For a moment, we just stood there, suspended between what almost happened and the reality pressing in from the other side of the door. I forced my feet to move, my body still humming with something I couldn't name. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Daniel. Drenched from the rain, his tie loosened, his expression shifting as he took in the scene before him. His gaze flickered between Alex and me, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "You're home early," I said too quickly, my voice strained. Daniel studied me for a moment, then glanced at Alex, his brows drawing together ever so slightly. "Yeah," he said, stepping inside and shaking the rain from his jacket. "Things wrapped up faster than I thought." Alex cleared his throat. "I should get going." Daniel nodded, his gaze still on me. I forced a smile, but I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us, suffocating in its intensity. As Alex moved toward the door, he hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, I knew everything had changed. For better. Or for worse. I avoided Alex for days, hoping distance would erase what had happened. But no amount of space could undo the shift that had already taken place, the quiet unraveling of everything I had once thought unshakable. The tension had bled into my marriage in ways I couldn't control. I caught Daniel watching me more often, his brow slightly furrowed as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces no longer fit the way they used to. The way I turned away from his touch too quickly. The way I seemed lost in thought, distracted even when I was right beside him. The way I no longer said his name the same way. Each moment of silence between us became heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible force, suffocating in its intensity. I told myself it was my own guilt creating the distance, that Daniel didn't actually know anything. But then, one evening, as I was rinsing the dishes, his voice cut through the quiet, steady but laced with something I hadn't heard before. Doubt. Is something going on between you and Alex? My hands froze under the stream of water. The plate I had been washing nearly slipped from my fingers, and I forced myself to breathe, to keep my movements steady, even though my heartbeat was hammering against my ribs. No, I said, too quickly. Of course not. I turned off the faucet and grabbed a towel, wiping my hands as if I could scrub away the guilt clinging to my skin. Daniel didn't look away. His eyes, deep and familiar, searched mine with an intensity that made my stomach twist. Then why does it feel like you're slipping away from me? Unspoken truths. I swallowed, forcing down the lump in my throat. The urge to confess, to lay everything bare, rose inside me like a tide, threatening to drown me. But what would I even say? That Alex had looked at me in a way that made me feel something I hadn't felt in years? That I had let myself stand too close, let my heart race too fast, let my mind wander to places it never should have gone? That I had wanted something I had no right to want? I couldn't. Because even though I hadn't crossed the final line, I had already stepped too close to the edge. And Daniel would see it for what it was, betrayal. So I did the only thing I could. I lied. I'm just tired, I said, my voice softer now, threading it with exhaustion instead of guilt. Work has been stressful, and I haven't been sleeping well. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was still watching me, still searching, as if waiting for me to crack, for me to tell him the truth he already suspected. Then, after a moment that stretched too long, he sighed. Maybe we should get away for a few days, he said. Just us. The suggestion caught me off guard. A trip. A reset. A chance to pull myself back from the edge before I fell completely. But was I ready for that? Could I fix something when I wasn't sure if I wanted to fix it? A message that changed everything. Later that night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I had told myself that avoiding Alex would make things easier. That if I ignored whatever had started between us, it would fade. But pretending something didn't exist didn't make it disappear. It only made it grow in the shadows, unchecked. And then my phone buzzed. I shouldn't have looked. I should have turned over, closed my eyes, and forced myself into restless sleep. But my hand reached for it before my mind could stop me. One message. From Alex. Are you okay? 3 simple words. But they shattered my resolve. Because the truth was, I wasn't okay. And he knew it. And despite everything, despite the guilt, the fear, the weight of my choices, I wanted to reply. I wanted him to know that he wasn't the only one struggling with this. That I felt it too. I hovered over the keyboard, my fingers trembling. But before I could type a response, another message appeared. Can we talk? A choice. A single moment that could change everything. And as I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, I realized that whatever decision I made next would define the rest of my life. The evening air was thick, pressing down on me as I opened the door. Alex stood there, his presence undeniable, his expression raw with emotions I wasn't sure how to name. For days, I had been trying to avoid this moment, trying to pretend that everything between us could be neatly folded away, tucked into the past like an old letter never meant to be read again. But there he was. And there I was. And there was no more pretending. His eyes, dark and searching, locked onto mine. I need to know, he said, voice low, rough, urgent. Are we pretending this never happened? A simple question. A demand wrapped in vulnerability. My breath caught in my throat. Because I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I wasn't ready to say it out loud. I hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was enough. Alex saw it. Felt it. The unspoken truth stretched between us, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. Before I could find the words, before I could lie or tell the truth or do something in between, the door behind me creaked open wider. A presence at my back. And then, Daniel's voice. What's going on? A moment of realization. The silence that followed was the kind that could split open a life in a single breath. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I met Daniel's eyes. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He wasn't even accusing. Just still. Too still. Like someone standing at the edge of something they didn't want to see, but already knew was there. His gaze flickered from me to Alex, and something inside him shifted, his shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, his fingers curled just slightly at his sides. Recognition. Realization. And then, the slow, terrible unraveling of certainty. "Julia," Daniel said, my name more a question than a statement. I opened my mouth. But what could I say? That this wasn't what it looked like? That Alex had just shown up and I didn't know why? That nothing had happened, not really, not in the way that mattered? Because all of it would have been true. And all of it would have been a lie. Alex took a step forward. "Daniel, I don't." The single word cut through the night air, sharp and final. And it wasn't directed at Alex. It was meant for me. Cracks in the foundation. The weight of Daniel's stare held me in place, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. I wanted to fix this. To rewind the night, to erase the moment, to take us back to before any of this had begun. But there was no going back. I could see it in the way Daniel's face paled, the way his hands flexed at his sides like he was resisting the urge to clench them into fists. He wasn't a man prone to anger. He wasn't a man who raised his voice or lost his temper. But in that moment, I wished he would. Because maybe then, I could have handled it. Maybe if he yelled, if he accused, if he gave me something to push back against, I could find my footing. But instead, he just looked at me. And that was worse. So much worse. "Tell me the truth." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something breaking. "Is there something going on between you and Alex?" "No," I said. Too fast. Too automatic. His eyes flickered. "Say it again." I swallowed hard. "Daniel, I." "Say it again," he repeated, and this time, his voice wasn't steady. It cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to hear the pain laced beneath it. I couldn't say it. Not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't the whole truth. Because maybe nothing physical had happened, but something else had. Something I couldn't take back. The hesitation was all he needed. And just like that, I watched the foundation of our marriage fracture beneath us. The beginning of the end. Daniel exhaled sharply and took a step back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable. But I felt it like a landslide. "I should have seen this coming," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I shook my head, my throat tightening. "Daniel, I swear, You didn't cheat on me." His words were bitter, almost mocking. "But you thought about it." The truth of it landed between us, undeniable. A silence stretched, suffocating. Then, without another word, Daniel turned and walked inside. I stood frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs as I watched him disappear down the hall. The door shut softly behind him. Not a slam. Not a dramatic exit. Just a quiet, deliberate close. And somehow, that was worse. I let out a shaky breath, my vision blurring as I turned back to Alex. He looked wrecked. Like he hadn't expected it to play out this way. Like he hadn't realized just how much damage had already been done. "I should go," he said, his voice hollow. I nodded, unable to speak. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, like he wanted to say something, like he wanted to fix something, like he wanted to make it right. But there was nothing left to say. So he walked away. And I stood there, in the dim glow of the porch light, listening to the sound of my world coming undone. The silence in our home became unbearable. After Daniel closed that door, after Alex walked away, something inside me splintered. I had stood there on the porch for what felt like an eternity, my arms wrapped around myself, listening to the night, to the hum of the street lamp, to the distant sound of car tires on pavement. But inside? Inside was worse. Inside, Daniel sat in the darkened living room, a glass of whiskey untouched on the coffee table, his wedding band turning slowly between his fingers. He didn't say a word when I walked in. Didn't look at me. The weight of his disappointment, his betrayal, hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned too long. I wanted to speak. To explain. To reach out and take his hand and tell him that this wasn't what he thought it was, that I never meant for it to happen. But the truth was, I didn't even know what it was. Had it been love? Or just the thrill of something almost happening, the quiet rush of a moment stolen? Did it even matter? Because the damage was already done. A shattered foundation. Daniel stayed home from work the next day. Not because he needed time to process, but because the weight of everything had settled into his bones, making movement impossible. I moved through the house like a ghost, my presence unwelcome but unavoidable. Every glance, every brush of our shoulders in the kitchen, every moment we spent in the same space felt wrong. The easy way he used to laugh? Gone. The warmth in his voice when he said my name? Gone. The foundation of trust we had built over years? Cracked beyond recognition. Alex didn't come back. Not that I expected him to. He was smart enough to know when to disappear, when to let the dust settle. But the absence of him didn't fix anything. If anything, it made it worse. Because now, it was just Daniel and me. Two people who used to belong to each other. Two people who now felt like strangers. Unanswered questions. Do you love him? The question came one evening, late, when I thought maybe, just maybe, we were getting through the worst of it. Daniel's voice was quiet, but his words were a knife, slicing clean through the fragile thread holding us together. I closed my eyes. No. He studied me, searching for a lie. Not because he thought I would lie to him, but because he needed me to lie to him. He needed me to say something that would make this easier, something that would let him believe in us again. But I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't love Alex. I knew that now. But I had still wanted him, hadn't I? I had let myself stand on the edge of something dangerous, let myself lean into the possibility of something that should never have been a possibility at all. Was that any better? Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. Then why? I wished I had an answer. For him. For myself. But I didn't. So I said nothing. The things that can't be repaired. People talk about forgiveness like it's a switch that can be flipped. Like if you say the right words, if you show enough remorse, if you prove you're sorry, then everything can go back to the way it was. But that's not how trust works. Trust isn't just about what you did. It's about what you were willing to do. And Daniel? He couldn't unsee it. Couldn't unfeel the distance that had grown between us, the way I had let something else, someone else, fill the spaces that should have only been his. He tried. God, he tried. But there are some cracks you can't fill. Some fractures too deep to mend. Some choices that, once made, cannot be unmade. Looking back, I still wonder, was it really love? Or was it just the temptation of something forbidden, the thrill of something dangerous? Would I have been so drawn to Alex if he hadn't been off limits? If he hadn't looked at me like I was someone new, someone exciting, someone who hadn't already been chosen? I don't know. I don't think I ever will. But I do know this. That night changed everything. Forever.